Okay, to start now, Sarah, please.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for joining us for this session on power analysis. As you know, the theme of HSR 2020 is reimagining health systems. And over the past few years, including among a growing number of HSG members, there's been increasing interest in how research on the topic of power can contribute to reforming or even transforming health systems. But does research on power really promote fundamental change? That's the question that we want to address today in this session. Is it more pie in the sky, an intellectual exercise that, while illuminating, fails to create the change that tackles the embedded and unjust power structures that sometimes inhibit progress towards better health and more equitable health incomes? We want to discuss this today, and we want to hear from you. So we had originally imagined that this session would take place in Dubai as a highly interactive and fluid discussion in a small group format. But with COVID and the new virtual format, that means we've had to think differently. So there's the added advantage that there are many more of you from further reaches who are able to join us. So thanks for being here. We have organized this session in a traditional panel format, but we put a strong emphasis on audience questions and engagement. So it's your interaction that will really make this session valuable. Our format will be four quick fire questions to which each of our panelists, who I'll introduce in just a moment, will have 2 minutes to respond. Then we'll have 30 minutes of question and answer with the audience participants. And we also have a few polls to make this maximally interactive. So now I would like to briefly introduce our fantastic panel. Here is our wonderful group. They're joining us from all around the world. So thank you especially to those for whom it's very early or very late. First, we have Veena Sriram, Assistant Professor at University of British Columbia. Rakesh Parashar of Oxford Policy Management. Shea Abimbala, Editor-in-Chief of BMJ Global Health. Jesse Bump, Assistant Professor at Harvard University. And Marta Schaff, an independent consultant based in NYC. Now that I've introduced the panelists, I would like to start this session with by asking you, the participants, a question. So if you can see in the online session, we have a poll. You should be able to vote. It's about studying power in HPSR, Health Policy and Systems Research. And we want to know if you think it is essential for positively transforming health systems and outcomes, if it's a pie in the sky intellectual exercise, or if we should ask you after the panel. So go ahead and let us know what you think. I see lots of votes. I'll give you just a few more moments. All right. So I think you should be able to see the votes now. 85% of you thought that studying power in HPSR was essential for positively transforming health systems and outcomes. I think probably many of our panelists would agree, but we really want to try to problematize this in the course of our discussions today. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to our brilliant panel and ask our first question for them with a quick response from each. And that first question is, what research questions related to power are conceptually and practically important? So I'd like to start by going to Veena. Veena, what questions, research questions related to power are conceptually and practically important?
Great, thank you, Sarah, and hello everyone from Vancouver. So in terms of what questions are conceptually important, I think at the heart of any research on power or any research in public health is this question of what is driving inequity. So regardless of the discipline that we're coming from, regardless of the kind of approach we're taking, if our focus is trying to understand what is driving inequity, we are then concerned with power. So I think in terms of what questions are important, it really runs the gamut from, and this can be at every level, from high level policy questions to what is happening within local health systems. And the way I see it is that we're all trying to put this puzzle together, and each of us in our own ways doing research that sort of adds one piece to that across, again, across disciplines, across contexts, across geographies. One quick example of sort of how discussions around power are increasingly entering the mainstream. I think in the US last year, there was a lot of discussion around race and health. And we started to see a discussion of moving from thinking about race as just sort of one aspect that's driving inequity to really racism that's at the core of everything that we're trying to aim towards. Personally, from my end, I think we do need more research on policy making bodies, on high level national, state, global level institutions, and also on transnational movements such as the diaspora, corporations. And I think we're seeing more of this as we go along. Now, in terms of practically what is possible, I think that's the big question. I think that's at the heart of this session. Do we want to do research for immediate change, or are we more comfortable with taking the long view, or taking a longer term approach and having change come several years, several decades from where we are now? And so that can be really complex. So I think that's the practical question really depends on sort of when you want to see the change you want. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Veena. Over to Rakesh. What research questions are conceptually and practically important?
Thanks. And I think I'll build on what Veena has already said, using the changing context in our times, and really nesting the power research that we are talking about in these kind of contexts. And I think the power questions that are most relevant to us from a very current as well as futuristic view could be informed by this almost inevitable looking shift around monopolistic corporatization and technology that is coming in the health systems. And when this kind of a change is happening, I think it's important to understand how we can try and identify more responsible uses of power, because some of this change probably looks absolutely not avoidable. So whether there are dimensions of responsible power that can really inform the powerful players, and what should be those dimensions, how we can understand them, and how we can then cultivate responsible power if we have to really deal with some of these more centralized monopolistic forces. So that's on the conceptual side. And I think on the practical side, again, using this particular aspect of these changing contexts, I think it will be important for us to really think about some of the questions which are related to how can power balance be shifted more towards individuals and communities in order to anticipate and adapt for these wider changes that are happening in order to have better population and planetary well-being. For example, if we look at the public health facilities in India, which are these days mostly left only for the people who cannot afford private expenses, and 70% of the healthcare in this country is private. And some of these expenses are really still increasing despite a lot of policy framework. So what happens? In the course, it's likely that the private markets will also take over the entire public health system. And if that happens, how do we really make sure and understand what can individuals and communities can do at their level and can really empower themselves to deal with and to cope with such kind of a change? So I think that's the practical aspect I would like to think about on the power research.
Thank you so much, Rakesh. Thank you. Over to Sheye about research questions on power.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks to the two previous speakers. What I'm most interested in, and perhaps what I think we as a community of researchers don't give enough attention to, is the political process itself. The democratic process, the process of how people become leaders and how issues get on agenda within the democratic process. And I think that there's a lot that we still need to understand about how to get health on the political agenda. And especially not just the agenda of elites, but the agenda of people who should be in a position to drive what the elites do, what the politicians do. So how do we make people demand health? Or how do we get health into the minds and hearts of people in their day-to-day lives that then becomes something that is politically has currency? And I've been dismayed, frankly, by recent findings that suggest that the ways in which a government has handled the COVID-19 pandemic has had, or perhaps would likely have, little impact on their voting intentions. And that says to me a lot of things about how perhaps we have thought about power and how we could think about power more from the perspective of how we get health to be something that people care about in specific ways that then drive the political agenda. So we're coming from different, from the other end, rather than the politicians, we are coming from the people. Because I think that for me is a big missing box in many instances in how we approach the question of power and power analysis in health systems.
Thank you so much, Shay. Really interesting. Over to Jesse. Jesse, research questions on power.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to approach this question from a historical perspective, and one aspect of that is to ask, like, how did we get here? And public health and global health are filled with questions. They usually begin with the what questions, and those are technical. And when you know what, sometimes you turn to ethical, which you always should, but sometimes you do. And that's like the why question. But the missing link in most of our global health research is the how question. And that's where power comes in. You need to know not just what and why, assuming that you've gotten those right, you need to know how to go from there through to implementation. And that has many names for us. Sometimes we call it a knowledge gap or an implementation gap, but it really expresses this frustration that we know what we want to do, but it isn't happening for whatever reason. And research on power gets into that kind of whatever reason box. And it's extremely important to look in there very closely because it will reveal things about the inequalities that Vina was mentioning, about the long run processes, about the accumulation of resources in one group versus another. So, for example, if you're looking at power, a whole set of important questions is who got it? Why do they have it? Is it fair that they have it? And if it isn't fair, what can you do about it? So in my research, and I think in the world, one of the largest forces in inequality is historic extraction. So the processes and the sequelae related to slavery, to colonialism, to imperialism, and looking at how those processes took resources, accumulated them in some places, and deprived them in others, reveals to you why there's inequality now, and suggests some way forward toward truth, reconciliation, even reparations.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for that perspective. Over to Marta on questions of power.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to know that you're all here if I can't see you. I really echo a lot of what my colleagues say, and so in order to not repeat that, I'm going to try to focus my remarks today on sexual and reproductive health and rights and come at this question of power and health systems through the SRHR lens. And I think there are several important research questions relating to some of what my colleagues have already said, such as agenda setting at international and national levels, funding, the extent to which a lot of the standard approaches that we take for granted actually disrupt power relations rather than assuming that they do so, looking at health facility, households, and communities. I think one reason why sexual and reproductive health is particularly interesting is because of the work that has been done by feminist theorists and researchers to show how SRH is distinct from other health issues insofar as many of the power dynamics at play relate to deeply held beliefs and prejudices about reproduction, about who's fit for motherhood, and who's allowed to be sexual. These beliefs affect all levels of decision-making, from the household, as we well know, to the health facility, the way people are treated when they're seeking services, governments, and donors. So I think the US Global Gag Rule is a really interesting example. This is a 2017 rule restricting the use of US global health assistance in the context of reproductive health. And so this is a very egregious, stark example of the imposition of social norms that are at odds with the evidence being imposed by one country on another. So I think calling these things out as power and understanding them as manifestations as power is central to ensuring that the policies and programs that we advocate actually serve to dismantle what Vina referred to as the drivers of morbidity and mortality, as well as human rights more broadly.
Thank you so much, Marta, and to all of the panelists. So we've heard from our panelists about different topics, ethical dimensions, specific groups to look at when we're studying power, aspects of the policy-making process, historical perspectives, and the types of social phenomena that Marta was just evoking. So really interesting different views and cuts at that question. So let's go to round 2 of this lightning round. We would like, while our panelists are speaking, for our audience members to think about the question as well. And please do share your own thoughts and examples in the chat forum. The question for panelists and for participants is, how can we ensure that research on power is actually helpful to promoting positive change in health systems? So how do we move from our academic perspectives to positive change? So we'll start off this time with Rakesh. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Sarah. So this time I think I would think from a perspective that when it comes to the change in the health systems, most of it is either in the hands of the systems people or with the service users or communities. And we as researchers have to facilitate this change. So power research, I think in that context, needs better communication and engagement with both sides. And this has to come in a very close-knit collaboration with these actors who are in the decision-making or influencing space. What happens that these actors many times find a lot of concepts of power quite intangible and unactionable that we talk about. And it becomes absolutely critical for them that we engage with them in the process of really making these concepts more nuanced to them right from the beginning of the research process, rather than relying on the disseminations afterwards. And my experience with a little bit of our research also tells me that the kind of language and the constructs we use in power research can be very distant from the language that is used by the local health actors. So probably we need bridging that gap as well if we really want to bring some change. So I think these are the 2 points I wanted to put forth.
Thank you so much, Rakesh. Let's now go to Shay. Shay, how can research be actually helpful to promoting positive change?
My point is very related to Rakesh's point, which is that I think that researchers have to become activists, or at least a very large bulk of researchers studying power have to see themselves as activists. We have to see ourselves, I have to include myself here, as activists. Otherwise, we will be speaking a different language and prioritizing the things that we feel are interesting intellectually or conceptually, or that the journal wants to publish, or is good for whatever is good for what incentivizes what we do. Whereas in many instances, the world goes on and the process of change goes on, and our role in it becomes really peripheral if we are sort of throwing in stones from academia. So I think an important way to get the idea of power, the way to deploy power analysis to make change happen, is to be those people who are actually trying to make that change happen. I'll hopefully come back to this point later. But one of the things that we have to learn to do as researchers as well is to not only look at the power in the health system as though the health system was separate from the system in which we function as researchers or as individuals. That often the things that hold us back are the power structures that within the systems in which we operate as researchers. And if we are not willing to tear those down, how can we be able to tear down the power in the health system in which we are trying to be impactful?
Thank you so much, Shay. Let's go to Jesse.
Thank you. This is another excellent question, and it speaks to a common complaint about academia, which is a lot of its work maybe doesn't matter that much. And one aspect of global health work is that it's always guided, or should always be guided, by the normative commitments of public health, which are to advance everyone, to advance humanity, to uphold the highest standards for everyone, and to realize equality in all dimensions. Now, that goal is too stratospheric to immediately implement, but real questions for researchers become practical when you're trying to ask, how does your project connect to that goal? And there's a variety of ways. Not one is necessarily better than the other, but some are participatory. If you're not sure what question matters, ask someone who would be affected by it. Ask someone who you think might use the research. Use the research process itself to change the distribution of power. Every research project is an opportunity to engage, to mentor, to expose processes of inequality, to expose opportunities for some. And so finding questions that matter is both an intellectual commitment and a practical one. So what I would advise researchers is to think carefully about the question they're asking, to have some end game in mind, to have some end game that goes beyond the paper that you plan to generate or the report that you plan to generate to the change that you're trying to spark. And once you've understood the change that you need, then you can figure out how the question will fit into it. And then you can start testing out your idea on the audiences that you want to influence to say, well, actually, does this question matter to you? And have I posed it in a way that would generate results that will be useful to you? If you do it in that sort of interactive way, you can move much more easily toward the activism that Shay is advocating. And I think that would help you realize the change that you want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Over to Marta.
Thanks. I endorse everything that my colleagues have said. And, I'm working right now on an analysis of sexual and reproductive health programs and policies, at least insofar as these are represented in the peer-reviewed literature, which is, of course, an imperfect assessment. And I'm finding that with the exception of efforts to change the dynamics of decision-making about contraceptive use or facility delivery at the household level, that programs and policies rarely seem to be explicitly addressing power. Yet, on the other hand, we have a wealth of qualitative research conducted over decades describing how and why different manifestations of power matter, not to mention the very deep and long work of activists in demanding attention to harmful norms and hierarchies. So I think in this, you really see this disconnect between the research and the policy. And so it's that we're trying to affect. So I agree with a lot of what Jesse said, that I think we need to continue to embrace new and different approaches to research to ensure that it's helpful, such as crafting research questions that can be targeted to actors who are amenable to change. So thinking about the endpoint in advance. Giving grassroots actors pride of place in elaborating research questions and agendas, and bringing, I think, some circumspection to the widespread call to directly engage questions of politics. On the one hand, hierarchies are absolutely political and we should not avoid or ignore them. I am an activist myself. And I think they are some of the most important drivers of the challenges that we want to address. But on the other hand, as those of us who work on abortion in the United States can attest, politicization has undermined the health agenda and put people's lives in danger. So there are very complicated questions to engage here.
Thank you so much, Marta. Great points. Over to Veena, please.
Yeah, so this is a great question, but I want to come at it from the perspective of thinking about questions on power that are actually quite controversial or might disrupt the structures of power that exist in ways that the people who occupy those spaces will actively fight against. And I'm thinking about, for example, research on very powerful philanthropies, very powerful regulatory institutions, powerful actors within government. If one decides, or a team decides to do research on those actors, then you have some choices to make. I think the first choice is sort of what is the time frame of the change that you would like to see? Is it something that you'd be comfortable with sort of having it sort of seep into the literature and over decades, like Paul Starr influencing a generation of medical students to become more progressive. Or if you want to do something more near term, then perhaps thinking about forming some strategic partnerships in terms of who you do the research with, but then also in terms of how you disseminate it. And I think with COVID, we're seeing that the nexus between researchers and journalists has really sort of been a major factor in highlighting gaps and also promoting change where it's needed. So I think we can do better in those fronts.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists. Really interesting reflections about lessening the distance between the types of people who are change makers and activists and who are researchers, and in fact, trying to be the people who make that change happen, excuse me. And all while keeping in mind the normative commitments that really underpin public health. And being strategic about what is the change that we're trying to affect, and thereby selecting who we work with, how do we disseminate, et cetera. So some really interesting reflections there. I think I'd like to invite our colleague Steph Top to speak a bit about what the audience has been talking about in the chat forum and examples that have been shared there. Steph, over to you.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. So a few really interesting reflections and questions coming through. I think the first question that I wanted to throw out to the panelists came from Tolib. And Tolib asks, how can or should research on power be cognizant of various forms of power within research itself? So north, south, researcher, participant type power. And I might throw this to Rakesh and Jesse to respond to based on your earlier reflections.
Let's hear from Rakesh first and then Jesse. Rakesh, you're on mute.
Hi, Steph. Could you just repeat the last bit? Sorry, I lost it.
Sure. So the question is, how can research on power be cognizant of the forms of power within research itself? So that might be power from north to south, or power between the researchers and participants themselves, or many other forms of power, of course, within research.
Absolutely. I think that's very critical for us as researchers to really understand and work upon when we are engaging with any research activities. I think some of the dimensions which are important to really examine some of these points that you already raised, but also to understand that as a researcher, at times when we are researching either with the communities or with the health system actors, we also come with certain kind of knowledge privileges as well as certain kind of backgrounds that allow us to really make sense of the thing that they are doing and turn them into our own construct. So I think it is important to engage with them and really have a bridging of this gap between our knowledge constructs and what the people on ground really think, and then really communicate those constructs to them as well, so that there's no eventual gap in the translation of that knowledge to our theoretical constructs. So I think that's one important area I think we should really reflect upon.
Thank you. Over to Jesse.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think it's an important personal commitment to be aware of your own context and to be aware of yourself. So none of us are responsible for where we're born or the endowment that we get, but we're all responsible for knowing what that is, and we're all responsible for what we do with it. So as a researcher, and as someone who's in a country and at a specific institution at Harvard University that have benefited from historic extraction, that have accumulated resources that were stolen from others, I think it's a personal commitment that you should be aware of that. You should know about that. You should talk about it. This is part of the web that connects all of us. And some of us are designated arbitrarily as winners and others arbitrarily as victims. Now, those two groups are vastly unequal, and everything that we do reflects those historic processes. Nobody is disconnected from this, and nobody who's alive now is personally responsible for the things that happen, but all of us can do something about it. And to be able to do something about it, we need to know about it. So when we're researching power itself, that can be used as an activist commitment, a device, a process to both understand and study and challenge, both as through its results and through the process. So I think if you're in a place that has resources, the best solution is one that you have to find for yourself, one that fits your own ideas, one that fits your own commitments, one that fits your position. But you try to cross-subsidize with it, take as much of it as you can, let other people in, enfranchise others, use those positions of power, if you have them, to bring other people with you, to bring other people along, to highlight issues that, maybe you didn't think of them, maybe you get them from others. But it's really, really important to understand that context so that you can do something about it. If you don't, you just end up serving yourself. And I think for that reason, studying power begins with self-awareness, begins with that knowledge of yourself and your position in the game. And then, because the list of things that you're not is always a lot longer than the list of things that you are, you can understand other people's perspectives. You can invite them in, you can benefit, you can share. And together we can take on the inequalities that we seek to challenge.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Back over to you, Steph.
Thanks, Sarah. So we might just go for Zia's question here, and I'll address this towards Marta if I can. So Zia says, in low middle income countries, sexual and reproductive health rights are very dependent on power structures. So how can we address power at the meso level? And she qualifies that in a subsequent comment, saying by meso level, she refers to the municipality, the district, or other levels at that another low level, while the micro level relates to, for instance, the household or the individual scale.
Thanks, Steph. I think that's a great question that applies not just to SRH, but to lots of areas where there's a real gap at, there's work that happens in communities and households, and then work that happens at the national level and sort of agenda setting, and really ignores this middle piece. I think some of the interesting work that I've seen recently comes from Jashodra Dasgupta, where she looks at building political capabilities. So to link to some of what we've said about being activists, not only ourselves, but thinking about activism as a way of addressing power within communities as well. And they've really focused at not only in India block and health facility level actors, but district level actors as well. And in some ways, filling in for the link that isn't, unfortunately, functioning very well between national and district and between local and district. So I don't want to get into the minutia of it. I'm happy to have a longer conversation with her offline. But I think thinking critically about how to sort of connect the dots among these different pieces. And when we're thinking both about research and about strategies, is creating ways to aggregate feedback, input, lessons from the local and bringing those up and bringing some of the discussions at the central level down.
Thanks, Marta. Sarah, do I have a few more minutes? Because we have, or do we need to move on?
Let's go ahead. If the questions are good, let's keep them coming.
Okay, so I have a great question here from Shamishta, who is asking the panelists to share their thoughts on gender as a direct manifestation of power relations at all levels, and querying how health policy and systems research actually addresses this construct. And I wonder if we might start with that, with Veena, Veena's thoughts on that.
Thank you, Steph. That's a really, really interesting question. And to me, it's an example of where we can see more intersections between research on power and research on gender. And truly, research on gender is about power. So I think one of the other panelists mentioned, we're using potentially different labels for different topics when I think ultimately we are talking about something that's quite similar. I think there has been clearly so much work that's been done on gender and health policy and systems. In terms of policy analysis, I think we can push further in that direction. One quick idea that comes to my mind is, for example, thinking about gender dynamics as they relate to policymaking structures and membership and representation. Just an example from COVID, there was a paper I think that BMJ Global Health published around the representation of women on COVID task forces and how low that was. So that to me is just one example of the myriad questions that there are around the lack of proper gender representation in policy-making bodies. We can stretch that further in so many different directions and avenues. But I also think there could be greater dialogue between these communities of researchers working on gender and working on health policy and power in politics.
Thanks, Veena. I have a question here I'd like to direct towards Shay, given his promotion of the activist researcher from Pragati, who would like to hear thoughts from the panelists on studying power of industries, particularly tobacco, ultra-processed food, and pharmaceuticals in the context of commercial determinants of health. Over to you,
So
Shay.
this is not something I study personally, but it's something I'm a huge fan of. In my role as an editor, it's something I've been trying to promote lately, sort of not an invitation to deluge, but something that I'm really keen for us in the health policy and systems research world to start to think about very clearly. And two lines I think excite me about the body of work that I'm reading of late. The first is to understand what has worked historically. So there's a paper, for example, coming out soon that looks at the historical ways in which the Thai people and Thai government held tobacco companies at bay in the 1980s. It failed eventually, but they were successful over several years until it came crashing. And they are positioning that lessons from that period to inform how they combat the electronic smoking devices that is currently banned in Thailand, but they see a repeat of the same strategies that the industry used in the 1980s right now. So sort of drawing lessons from what worked then to how to inform what we'll do now. So I'm interested in that kind of analysis that looks at what's worked in the past. And the second line of analysis that I'm interested in is what works in terms of what creates reputational damage for industry effectively. Now, this is something that's very difficult to even begin to think about, but I think we have to find a way to get into their heads as well. Otherwise, it will be hard for us to understand how to combat them. So there's also a body of work that's beginning to think clearly about historically, what has it meant for industry to run away, right, from something that they're actively promoting, and how does that play out going forward? So really, I'm keen on this body of work. I don't study it, but I'm a huge consumer of it and a huge fan of it.
Can I also ask Jesse for your thoughts on this, because I know this is a space that you do some research in.
Yeah, look, the historical aspect that Shay mentions about how the same tactics that were used in the 80s are being used now. Look, this is true over the very long term. To try to understand the commercial determinants of health is just one statement about how you want to understand the way context influences people's well-being. So the first person to articulate that in the health and medical literature, might be Hippocrates. People who have talked about the environmental influences on health for a long time. The name social determinants comes from Virchow in the 1850s. And here today, when you're looking at commercial determinants, you're really just asking another version of Who has power? Who has the power to shape perception, to shape regulation? And then what we want to know as researchers interested in health, we want to know, how do we contest that? You know, how is it that companies became more powerful than individual well-being? You know, how is it that some products are regulated, some products are not regulated? Some companies seem to have more power than some countries. You know, you want to know, how did this happen? And there are answers to how that happened. One of them is colonization, which is one way of bifurcating health and economics. And the colonial project, not to get too far into it in a brief answer, separates those two things by extracting resources. So the central banks of colonies were in the metropoles. Economic policy and extraction happened from London, from Paris, from DC. Health policy was always a local issue. So essentially you're telling people, we're going to steal your stuff, but you're responsible for your own health and education. And that interrupts the cross subsidization that you need to have a functioning society. You need to be able to tax your industry to subsidize public health, which is never a place you're going to make any money at all. The commercial determinants is just one little piece of that. So if you're asking, well, why does a tobacco company have the wherewithal, the resources, the connections to push around a country? This is the answer. Because the tobacco company gains the resources, gains the political connections, the economic connections to overrule domestic governments. That's just a quick example, but anywhere you look, whether it's processed foods, the alcohol industry, tobacco, firearms, you'll find a very similar situation.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm really appreciating the richness of this panel with both historical and contemporary perspectives. Steph, is there a last question before we move on to the next lightning round?
Yeah, one last question, and I'll direct this to Rakesh and Veena, if I may. So this is from Jill in Cape Town, and this, I think, touches on something that we were talking about right at the beginning of the session. She says, in my experience, the analytical work on power, for example, the power cube analysis, can become very abstract very fast, which can end up having less utilization. I've been wondering whether it would not be useful for health policy and systems research to be quite specific about our intentionality to connect power analysis and power action. For example, in the same way you would expect to see something on research translation in a protocol as an ethical issue, to ensure that all studies looking at power are also reflective about what they will do about it. So Rakesh and Veena, what are your thoughts on that?
Do you want to go, Veena?
Sure. That's a great question, and something that I think I'm constantly wrestling with myself. I agree that, especially I think this is true of all of us in this panel, that we are doing research in order to effect some version of change. And I really like that example of using the power cube, and something Rakesh mentioned, that translating those concepts for folks who are sort of doing the bread and butter of public health it sometimes shows their limitations of those concepts, and are we barking up the wrong tree? But I'll come at this a little bit differently. I think when it comes down to trying to effect change from particularly complex problems that we don't necessarily have a connection to within the decision-making ecosystem. So whether that's a policymaker or whether that's a industry leader or whoever it might be, a politician, if we don't have those connections and networks in order to effect that change, translating our findings into actions in the near term becomes very hard. So I think that's when we have to make some decisions about, okay, what are some other ways that we can disseminate this in order for this to reach a wider audience? It may not be action in the traditional sense, but it is getting the word out. So maybe we should be doing more in terms of op-eds as soon as we publish or finish coming up with our findings for a study. Podcasts, there's so many different ways that we can communicate our findings beyond just research papers. But I also think we have to be careful about sort of how we're going about doing this, because just one more point to make on that is, especially if we are working very closely with the policy institutions that we are researching, this becomes a little treacherous. So I'll leave it there, and I'm curious for Rakesh's thoughts on this.
Thanks, Veena. I think that's brilliant. And to answer Jill's question, I think I would believe that it's not either or, whether we are doing more conceptual, more theory building power research that influences the wider understanding of how really power plays, vis-a-vis doing more action-oriented power research. I think the research has a scope of both, as one of the questions in this session was also there. And for people who are working in the health systems, who are dealing with the more day-to-day problems, I think it's important for more practice-oriented, action-oriented power analysis that can really inform their actions. But I think on a larger societal systemic level, it's also really important to keep identifying those conceptual frameworks and keep building on that discourse as to what power really means and how really power can be understood in different ways. For example, if I'm a service user and I'm going to a health facility or to avail any health service from even a community health worker, can I, in a way, recognize whether there was a certain kind of a power that was really used to deliver or not deliver the service for me? So this is a very conceptual and theoretical question to ask, but eventually at a practical level, that if the society and the people and the people who are in the action space are able to understand these dimensions, that's also very important. So I think both sides of the research are important. The later part is more immediate, and the former, which is more conceptual, is more larger and longer term space question. And I think both will have their space in the research.
Thank you so much, Veena and Rakesh. Thank you, Steph, and thank you above all to the audience for those excellent questions that are really enriching our discussion. I think let's move on to the next lightning round. For this, we'd also like to have some audience participation in the form of a poll. So the topic of this lightning round question is about obstacles to using power research, because I think we're all on board with how important it is. We've talked about different ways of doing it, and we've already evoked a few of those obstacles, but I think now let's really dig down into what they are. So this is a big poll. Put on your hats. Let me share it now. Sorry, small technical difficulty with trying to share the poll here. Maybe our HSG colleagues can help us. Okay, here we go. Please check out the poll. So there's a lot of different answers. And as I said, this is about the obstacles to using power research. Now, you may look at some of these answers and say, it's all of them, which I think makes a lot of sense. These are some of the things that we came up with to sort of set the basis for this discussion. So some of the answers are: donors won't fund research perceived as political, donors and governments won't fund research that undermines their own power, social hierarchies are embedded amongst those studying and implementing policies, lack of practical solutions coming out of research, not enough links between researchers and policymakers, over-reliance on theory and concepts from Northern scholars, and we've definitely missed some. So that's why we're looking for you to add what we've missed into the chat. Thank you to everyone who is voting. It's interesting that many of these have already been evoked. So just maybe 5 more seconds for people to vote, and then we're going to get straight to the discussion. 3, 2, 1, okay. So let's see the results. Can everyone see the results? So it looks like the #1 obstacle, according to our audience, is that social hierarchies are embedded amongst those studying and implementing policies. So that's really interesting. That's been brought up by a number of our panelists, Jesse and others as well. So I think let's turn this over to our panelists to talk about what obstacles exist to transformative change with respect to power structures in health systems. And I think we'd like to ask each of our panelists to speak from their sort of individual perspective as researchers, as practitioners, as authors, editors, and other types of professionals about how it's important to address these obstacles. So let's start out with Shea as a journal editor. What obstacles exist and how can we address them? Please go ahead.
Thank you. I was really interested in Jill's question earlier, because I think one of the things she was getting at was how do we create structures within the knowledge production system that compels people to think about what they do with power analysis. And I know that what gets published is only a tiny slice of what gets studied and what gets taught and what is known. But I think having such a process can begin a norm-changing process in which it becomes part of how people think about the work that they do, that it has to mean something, has to be translated in a particular process. And having people think through that, perhaps in a manuscript that is submitted to a journal, or even in the protocol article, or in a grant application, I think could shift the norms of how academic researchers think about what they do with power analysis. So I think that's an important thing from my perspective as a journal editor, but also echoing what Jill said earlier. The second point, I think, is also along this chain of knowledge production, is the as researchers, we have to take our own power very seriously. That we have this set of power to, for example, decide what question is worth answering, and how. In many instances, that is done independent of reality. And we also need to think about creating structures that constrain our ability to do that. And I'm not sure exactly what those structures look like, but as researchers and as people who produce knowledge, we need to design constraints, and perhaps others looking at us need to design those constraints alongside us, so that we become people who take the end result and the origins of power analysis seriously, and the knowledge embedded in it.
Thank you, Shea, for those reflections. Over to Jesse. Jesse, what obstacles exist and how can we address them?
Well, this is one of those circular problems where the biggest obstacle to change is power itself, and that's why we study it. So the world that you're seeing, it may be a world that none of us like, but it is the world that exists right now. And it's the world that the majority wants. It's what power has produced. So the first commitment in looking at it and understanding the obstacles is to say, honestly, this is what we have. And people are okay with it. You may not be, I'm certainly not, our audience probably isn't, but that is what all of the political economy of the world has produced. And so you may look at things, we all look, I'm going to assume here, I will presume that we look at the objects of our study, we look at the inequality, we look at racism, we look at inequalities in life and economics and opportunity, and we say, this is simply unacceptable. And to public health people, this is like the roof fell in and everyone in 5 seconds is going to come and put it back. And in fact, the world doesn't work that way. It doesn't want to do that. The world in general is okay with extraction that continues now. The horrific conditions that produce chocolate, for instance. Well, people like chocolate. They don't want to think too much about it. They don't really want to say, well, you know, why is the processed chocolate industry based in Belgium? Why is world famous chocolate in Switzerland? They don't really want to follow it around. It's like, oh, well, that's where it is. And yet there aren't, as far as I know, you know, there aren't any cocoa pods growing in either of those countries. So where'd it come from? Why is it? And we, as we study power, we have to confront that. For us, the normative imperative is so strong that you kind of think, you fool yourself into thinking that if I understood it better, then everyone else would change. So people would say, you know, the cadmium mining in Democratic Congo is so horrific that I won't buy a laptop. But we're not empowered that way, right? We need to be aware of these things, to study them, to unravel them, and to gauge those processes.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Jesse really getting into the difficult questions here around chocolate. I think that might touch a lot of hearts on this call, including my own. Over to Marta about obstacles and solutions.
Thank you. I think, I'm going to say something similar to what Jesse said, but using a very different lens. So I think, when you're thinking about sexual and reproductive health, there's such a long history of and continuation of colonialism and white supremacy, which of course pervade global health, but also have particular resonance in sexual and reproductive health, insofar as there are efforts to, control in some way the size of the total population or of certain populations such as ethnic minorities. And this is all manifest in large programs today and large governmental efforts, multilateral efforts. And it can be framed through different lenses, that we're liberating women from the burden of constant pregnancy, we're stemming environmental degradation, we're relieving household poverty. But I think there's one consistent thread in all of these, and that's that there's a lack of acknowledgement of the intrinsic value of autonomy, of sexual and reproductive autonomy. And so while we can craft policies and programs so that on paper they avoid coercion, the fact remains that settle and avert coercion persist in many contexts. We look at goals around acceptors or a number of women who give birth in a health facility. And my point with all of this is just to say that too few people who work within this system and who have potential power to influence the system, either as researchers or as practitioners, question this prevailing approach. We've been socialized to accept it. And I think maybe, college students studying sociology might look at it and understand that these dynamics are, but the longer you're in public health, the longer you sort of are socialized to take this as a given and not go back to the beginning. So I think, one important question is to look at where all of us sit and what our role is to try to raise these issues and to use that to, as Shay started to say, build the what next question into our thinking about what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Veena. Over to, thank you, Marta. Over to Veena.
Yeah, so in terms of obstacles, I kind of wanted to take it a step back to obstacles when we're actually doing the research, because I think if we want to build a knowledge base around power, we need many more researchers engaging on power. But we have a key problem there in that the positionality of the researcher, I think, is what really, quote unquote, allows you to do this type of research. And I'm just going to give you a quick example. I recently so I've been researching health policy in India for several years now, and fully recognize that a combination of my academic institution, being based in the States, my privilege, class, all of these things add up to me having more access to respondents in India. And I was interested in seeing how that would translate in the US. And I did a study around medical associations in Illinois, and very quickly was sort of cut down to size, could not get access to policymakers, could not get access to association membership, was told repeatedly that you should ask your government affairs office to contact us if you really want to get an interview with my own senators and Congress people, for example. And I say all that just to say that it was a reminder to me that I've been very fortunate in being able to do this research in India, and was quickly reminded when I did it in the States about how challenging it actually is for the vast majority of people to do this work, to access these people. So I think if we want to build this evidence base, if we want to translate this research into action, we're going to need to really acknowledge the fact that not everyone is able to do this research. And we have to kind of take these aspects of positionality into greater consideration and think about how we can break those down.
Thank you, Veena. That's a really interesting comparison to draw. Let's go to Rakesh for this lightning round.
Sure. So I think this is the incredible difficult part of the power research. And I think the obstacles are an unlimited supply, right from the macro, meso to micro levels. But I'll try and take a micro view here just to restrict with the time limits. So I think the funders, the governments, the research people, the implementing organization, all of us depend heavily on a lot of individual interests, a lot of relative clashes and competing priorities. And I think most of the individuals within the organizations play for their benefits and safety beyond the point of altruism and organizational goals. And I think the power analysis that exposes various organizations and groups also affects these individuals, and they would want to avoid it. So it's never easy to convince them externally to change the power structures or their power positions within those organizations. And that plays as a big obstacle. One crude, a very micro level and a very crude example is if we have to really change the gendered power dynamics in a typical health facility in India, where the medical officers are manning the health facility and the nurse midwives are really at a lower level of the power structures, and you want to tell the system that the nurses should really lead the hospitals and not the doctors. And who do you tell them? To the doctors or to the directors or the other managers in the system who have been taking the benefit of those power structures. So why would they really want to shift that? And how do we really convince them? So I think perhaps looking at individual level insecurities, threats, their interests, benefits, and a more transparent understanding and managing of all of it has to be done if we have to do more investments in power research and linking that to changing the power structures in the health systems.
Thank you so much to Rakesh and to all the panelists for these thoughts. I wonder if before we go on to the final question, okay, we'll go on to the final round, and then we'll use the remaining time for questions at the end. So to finish up with the thoughts of our brilliant panelists, we wanted to ask about an issue that has come up multiple times throughout this panel session, and that is, how can our research embody transforming power relations? So as we've said, we all have positions within power structures that vary across different axes. So when we're talking about the research that we do conduct in terms of methods, research team composition, and other considerations, how can we embody the transformations in power relations that we agree we seek to change? So let's go ahead and start this time with Jesse. Jesse, how can we embody these transformational power relations?
So I began this by talking about the importance of what researchers call positionality, like knowing your position in a game and trying to use it. And you know, for me, one of the end games is through education. So one of the reasons that institutions like mine have extra power is that not only have they extracted, but they've accumulated things that we think are good. There are a lot of smart people. We have a lot of knowledge, and I think one of the end games is to do more in dissemination and generation, co-generation with people in other countries, so that every time we help students, we train people, we generate ideas, people in other places will build capacities. So the end game for me is not that Harvard will always do international health. It will be that Harvard will just do its own things, and when asked, it will consult elsewhere, but there should be equivalent institutions in other places. As we reach that goal, an important part is to identify and recruit the right students, support them, speak to their needs, serve governments when they ask us, and not to abuse the power that comes with being at a particularly prestigious place. The risk of that is extreme. And that's one reason why global health is still disease-centric. It can't take on the social determinants because it's really just, it's organized around the specialties of northern, often physicians, sometimes economists, but around these disease lobbies, which prevent people from understanding the connections between disease, society, health, and development, and so on. I think power goes to the core of those inequalities, and all of us need to be aware of how it works and contest it whenever we can.
Thank you, Jesse. Over to Marta.
Thanks. So I think, we've started to talk about this to some extent already, and I'm sure my colleagues will add a lot more. I think, I don't want to overstate my case or simplify this as something, that this is a fight between good and evil. But I think that, we need to recognize that there's as others have said, a great deal of reflexivity. Sorry, it's like 5 a.m. From all of us. And in general, we work within a system of incentives that is at odds with transforming power relations, both internally within our institutions, within our research teams, and externally. And so I think, we all face small decision points daily relating to this, often framed as, there's a more expedient incentivized option and a harder start to affect some change option. So I think we need to all make personal decisions about how to engage those daily decision points, when we're going to say things, what we're going to say, beyond just these questions of creating, sharing power in design, elaborating research questions, representation in research teams, et cetera, that I think have been already more clearly elaborated. This question of how we as actors try to use our whatever privilege we have to change the structure of knowledge production. I really like that, Jay, thank you, is an important question, and one that we should all have with each other on a very concrete level of some of the kinds of things that we should advocate for, and what that means practically.
Thanks, Marta. Over to Veena.
Yeah, so I think in terms of embodying more equitable power relations within the research process itself, I think several of my colleagues here have mentioned these ideas. One thing that I would want to strive for personally going forward is to have more, to have a much more intentional effort when we are designing studies to really bring on board researchers, practitioners who are knee deep in these issues on a daily basis. To go back to my Illinois story for a second, one critical error that I made was that I didn't take the time that I needed to take to bring along researchers who've been studying some of these issues for decades. I recognize that we see much more of the reverse happening of folks from the global north going into low and middle income countries, studying something and then becoming an expert in it. I think that happens all too frequently. But I think we all need to sort of take a second to really think about who has the expertise, if it's regardless of the issue that you're studying. And I think Shay mentioned, Rakesh mentioned this too, that really working with people who are on the front lines of these issues, whether they're frontline workers, community members, is critical. But to make sure that this is embodied in our teams to the extent that we can, to the extent that's possible. And to also have strategic teams, I think, as we're going about, who does have that ability to affect change, who, if we get them involved early on enough, we have a better chance of having our findings heard.
Thanks a lot, Veena. Rakesh, over to you.
Sure. So I think my point is again very similar to what Veena just mentioned as to who really does the power research. And with the idea of embedding the research in those local contexts and really working with the people who are having a lot of local tacit knowledge, as well as subject matter expert from different domains, because power is very multidisciplinary. So I think it's very important that all of these people are together contributing to the research idea and the process. It becomes more important because the idea of power in itself is quite contested. So for example, when we say that a lot of health system people, managers, or the bureaucrats might be using a lot of coercive power to make things happen, those people might have a very strict sense of saying that if we do not use coercive power, the system does not work. So how do we really cope with that kind of different meanings of using power? So for them, it's a very positive construct, and for us, it's a very negative construct. So I think to really bridge that gap, we need to have all these different people on board. And I think the second part is on the methods, which is, I think whatever method we deploy to understand power, it almost becomes inevitable to not to include really any observational or participatory methods. Power research would essentially need to understand the realities in which people are working on a day-to-day basis. And I think having certain sort of observations and embedding the researchers in those realities is also critically important from my point of view.
Thank you, Rakesh. Both really great points that haven't necessarily been brought up in the conversation to this point. Let's go on ahead and finish with Shay.
Yeah, I was reading Amartya Sen, the economist philosopher's account of his career a couple of days ago. And he was telling the story of his book on the Bengal famine of 1943, the book length treatment of analysis of that famine, which was all about power. And after he published the book, lots of his friends told him that, well, your analysis is not original. People were writing exactly the same thing while this famine was going on. And for me, it's a reminder that we need to remember when we are doing our research, that there's a lot of knowledge, that we are not the repository of knowledge or the people who necessarily have the knowledge. Often the same level of power analysis is going on in communities, is going on in newspapers, is going on in other spaces that we need to learn to recognize and promote and in fact use rather than our own analysis in many instances, because those ones are less carried less research baggage and research language that could often alienate decision makers. So just remembering that as a way of reminding ourselves that we are not quite as, in fact, powerful as we think we are.
All right, thank you very much, Shay. So now we've talked a lot about the different obstacles to affecting transformative change. We've talked about how our own research can embody this change that we're seeking. And I think now would be a great time to go over to the audience. I'm sure there have been lots of interesting comments and reflections as we've been speaking. So Steph, would you like to share some of those?
Absolutely, although noting that we have incredibly limited time left for our session. So I think we're looking for a final rapid round response here. And we'll start with, I guess, we'll start with Rakesh if we could. And I'm selecting, we've had some great questions, but I'm selecting just to try and end on something of a reflective, but to potentially upbeat tone, Christoph's question. So Christoph said, given the fact that the global economic system is anything but stable now, there's potentially a window of opportunity for activists and also activist researchers to try to spark social and political tipping points. So while it's true, as Jesse mentioned, that the world has been largely okay with the political economy and the system in the world, it seems that these times may be gone. So one could move to a worse system or equilibrium, but also to a better one. How can we, as health policy and systems researchers, contribute to the latter, to a better system? So Rakesh, 30 seconds on your thoughts for that.
That's really a big one for 30 seconds. So often what comes to my mind is, I think as researchers, to look forward towards a more equitable world, given the current circumstances and the circumstances that have been accepted. I think the acceptance of some of the really normalized or really the things that have really become rooted now in the system is extremely important for us to really understand that, and we have to work with that change to really make our research questions. I do not have a specific thing to say, but I think the recognition and to work with that recognition is quite important for us.
Marta, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking personally, I consider myself an activist, and you know, I use a lot of what I learn from research or know or understand to be the case from research in my activism. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we can't accomplish necessarily worldwide change as researchers. But I also think that, you know, several people have pointed out the importance of starting from the end, starting where we want to be, and then backing into the research plan, backing into the team, and thinking very explicitly about where it is we want to go, what it is we want to do, and starting with that. Rather than the ways we've necessarily been socialized to start.
Thanks. And Bina?
So it's a great question. I think I would just add that even if the structures around us are changing, I think people in positions of power are not necessarily changing as rapidly. So I think we are still going to be dealing with the same structures and systems for the near term, at least. And maybe one tangible thing that I would like to do more of in the coming years is to actually establish relationships with these people in positions where they are affecting decisions and change, and ask them, okay, what can I do to be helpful to you in this area that I research, given the line of work that I want to do, and or that's not that I really put it, but given my research interests and my goals, what are some ways that I can be helpful to you, where we can sort of come together, and just to be much more proactive about that, and less walking on eggshells and more just sort of looking it straight in the face, and actually just building those relationships.
Thanks so much, Veena. And Shay?
I'll be very brief. I think we should all find social movements to join.
Thanks, Shay. And Jesse?
Yeah, look, as one of our historic abolitionists said, power concedes nothing without a demand. So get angry, get active, and go demand it.
I love it.
Sarah, I'm going to hand it back to you now.
Thank you. We have unfortunately reached our time. I wish we had the rest of the day to talk about this. This was a fascinating discussion. You know, I think that we started by talking about how we need to keep in mind the ethical or normative underpinning of public health, focused on the unjust conditions that lead to ill health, and talk about what is the change that we hope to achieve in our various roles as researchers, authors, editors, practitioners, etc. One theme that came up quite frequently was about, as Shay just said, that we need to be activists. That's a key function of our role if we want to start changing these power structures. We need to work with the communities most affected, but we also need to not undermine or underestimate our power as researchers. We talked quite a bit about our own positionality, which varies along different axes. I like the point made by Marta that we have many small decision points that we make daily, and then we need to be very thoughtful about how we take power into account at each level. Shay said that we need to change the structure of knowledge production, which is a great way to think about how we engage with power every day. And Jesse talked about how we can use our positions of power positively in order to make that change. Veena also talked about how we can focus more on dissemination and getting the word out instead of staying cloistered in our little researcher world. I think I'd like to finish with a point that Rakesh made, that power itself is quite contested. And, you know, as researchers and thinkers, I think that will give us a lot to chew on. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists for joining us early, late, notwithstanding. Thank you so much to Steph for the brilliant moderation, and to our HSG colleagues for facilitating this conversation. We really appreciate it. And thank you to our brilliant audience. Your participation really made this panel a success, and I really appreciated all the points that you brought to it. So I look forward to continuing this conversation in articles, on Twitter, and everywhere else. Thank you so much to everyone, and see you on the internet.